Today we're going to be starting with the next topic of chapter 10, which is looking at, again, looking at social power, but now trying to extend our knowledge of what is social power, how do the roles that we have in society influence the amount of social power we have, and how do people potentially change, or how do people's thoughts, feelings, and behavior change when they are assigned a role or when they're given a role. Okay, so we know that role, we know what the word role means. Role means like, your duty or something that you do. Okay, some kind of behavior that you engage in. And people can have multiple roles. So for example, as you can see in this first picture here, you could be a boss, okay? And the way you behave when you're a boss is very different from the way you behave when you're at home, when you're a mum, okay? Or the way that you behave when you're a coach is very different from the way that you behave when you're with your friends outside on a social outing. So depending on what your role is, your thoughts, feelings, and behavior will be different from, the way that you'd normally behave. Okay, so the first thing that is important for us to look at is this definition of role, that a role is the behavior adopted by a person or assigned to them. Okay, so people can take on roles that they automatically just take on and fit into, or people can be given roles. So if in class I say, okay, you are the class captain, that's a role that I'm assigning to you, okay? If, however, someone just steps up and says, okay, I volunteer to do this, then that's something that's being adopted by the individual. Okay, usually when, regardless of whether you're assigned a role or whether you've just stepped up and taken that role, generally your behavior, thoughts, and feelings will change as a result of taking that role up. Okay, you can't just be really careless and irresponsible if you're the school captain, for example. You have to be role modeling that leadership behavior there. Okay, now one of the things that we're going to do today, one of the really famous studies that we're going to explore and look at it's a study called the Stanford Prison Experiment, and it was conducted by a social psychologist named Philip Zimbardo. And the Stanford Prison Experiment ended up being one of the most controversial psychological experiments in psychological history, you could say. Okay, because it essentially, we're going to look at more details about it, but just to give you a quick idea of what it is, it essentially looked at this idea of, okay, if we just take a bunch of normal guys who don't have any mental health issues, who don't have any, sociopathic, qualities, who are just normal, healthy males, essentially, with no other issues, and we give them a role and say, okay, you're going to be the prison guard and you're going to be the prisoner, how do their behaviors, thoughts, and feelings change as a result of being assigned those roles? Okay, so you can, there's actually a movie, and that poster that's here is actually the movie poster, okay? The movie is obviously very intense. It is kind of disturbing, so we can't watch it in school. But some of you might have already watched it at some point. It is a pretty famous movie. And if you are interested in this study further and you want to look at this experiment further, you might be able to watch that movie. But again, like I said, disclaimer, it is quite intense because the actual study of the Stanford Prison Experiment is intense to begin with. So let's have a look at now, what is the study about and essentially what happened in the study. So Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment was conducted by this guy called Philip Zimbardo, whose picture is here. Okay, Philip Zimbardo was very interested in trying to understand how does, your role, your social role, how does that influence the kind of power you think you have? And how does that influence how you treat other people? Okay, so what he wanted to see, he wanted to prove, or he wanted to basically, bring forth this idea that it's not just our personality that affects how we treat other people, that affects how we, behave. It's actually our situation, the kind of situation that we're put in, the kind of environment that we're in, and in conjunction to this, the kind of role that we are given or the role that we have to step into. So that's essentially what Zimbardo kind of set out to investigate. Now, Zimbardo planned to kind of investigate this idea by conducting a prison simulation. So he didn't use a real prison, okay? Zimbardo worked in a university, which was Stanford University, okay, which is where the name comes from, Stanford Prison Experiment. So what he did was he took the basement of the university and he turned it into like a prison. So he made it look like a prison. It wasn't a real prison that they used because obviously, you can't just use a real prison. But he turned the basement of the university into a prison. So it looked exactly like a prison. No one else was working there when the Stanford Prison Experiment was happening. And essentially what he did was he got his participants to either role play prison guards or prisoners. Okay, so he divided them into half-half, and half of the males in this study were asked to be prisoners, and half of them were asked to be the prison guards. Okay, and then he observed how these newly assigned roles might affect the behavior shown by the participants in the study. Now, this YouTube link here is a really good video, which we usually show in class, but because we can't show it now, it'd be good if you guys can just copy paste this link maybe in the offline session and just have a quick watch of it. This is actual footage from the study, and Zimbardo also discusses his study a little bit in this video as well. So it's a good one to watch in conjunction to any others that I mentioned today. So what was the setup and the design of Zimbardo's experiment? Zimbardo wasn't making a joke of this. He actually wanted this to be a legit, proper experiment. And so essentially, he didn't just force people to be in his study. He put out an ad, okay? He put out an ad and said, okay, whoever wants to be in my study, you're going to read all the details about it. You're going to read the risks. And I only want the people who are genuinely interested to volunteer, okay? Eventually, what happened was 24 participants were selected. And out of these 24, all of the participants were white. All of them were middle-class students, and they were from all over America. None of them knew each other personally, so this couldn't affect the way that they treated each other because they were all strangers, essentially. Random allocation was used. Now, random allocation means that when Zimbardo got the 24 males, he divided them. So he put 12 to be prisoners and 12 to be guards. He just divided them randomly. The first 12 that he drew out of the hat, for example, those first 12 names, they would be prisoners. The remaining 12 would be guards. So no one could volunteer and choose what they wanted to be. He assigned those roles to them. Okay, now the participants, like I said before, they were judged to be emotionally stable. None of them had any emotional issues, any mental health issues. They were all physically healthy. No history of any kind of psychiatric problems, any kind of, negative qualities like being extremely dominant, being extremely corrupt, nothing like that. Okay, none of these boys that took part in the study had ever been to prison themselves. Most of them had never even been in trouble with the police before. So there was no past traumatic history of law enforcement issues or anything like that. Okay, now, to make it more legit, like I said before, the people who were asked to be the prisoners, they were actually arrested outside their homes. And you can see that in the first photo here. Zimbardo wanted to really make these guys get into the zone of being a prisoner. So he actually arrested them outside their homes to make their role more realistic, to make them really understand that they were prisoners from the get-go. Now, the prisoners actually had to sign a consent document, which actually did specify that some of their human rights would be suspended. However, I think most of the boys didn't really mind because they were being paid to take part in the study. So they were being paid $15 a day for up to 2 weeks. And back then, especially being university students, this might have been seen as a little bit of an appealing option, okay? They probably didn't understand or consider how intense the experiment would become. Okay, now this study, this picture at the bottom here, this is also an actual picture from the real Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment, okay? So you can see that they actually put them in cells, made them wear prisoner uniforms and all that stuff. Okay, so again, Zimbardo did want to make it as legit as possible. So this is just all the procedure and the findings of Zimbardo's study, and this is really put in a lot of detail in your book as well. In order to make you visualize what it really was like, I've also put all this information in here. So basically, like I said, they were arrested outside their houses, they were handcuffed, they were searched, they were read their rights. Everything that a normal prisoner would experience as a result of being arrested, they experienced that as well. Okay, they were then taken to the basement of the university, blindfolded, so they couldn't see what was happening around them. There was a loss of control there. And on arrival, they were stripped naked and issued with a loose-fitting smock, okay, like the white smocks that prisoners wear. And they were not allowed to wear their underwear as well. The ID was printed, so the ID number that prisoners have was printed on the front and the back of their smocks, and they had a chain bolted around one ankle. So really trying to get them into this zone that they are prisoners, that they're no longer just participants. They wore stockings to cover their hair, and they were referred to by their number only. So when the guards or when Zimbardo was talking to these prisoners, he wasn't like saying, oh, hey, Matt, can you please come here? He would say, hey, prisoner 1286, can you please come here? So essentially, these prisoners were losing that sense of identity because they weren't even being referred to by their own names. Now, each prisoner was allocated a cell, and each cell could house only 3 prisoners, which meant that, you know, essentially it was a cramped space there. Prisoners, in the same way that a normal prisoner would have to remain in prison for 24 hours a day, our participant prisoners also remained in prison 24 hours a day. And they had times for work, they had specific times to rest, and specific times in which they could go to the toilet or have their meals. Now, the guards wore military-style uniforms and glasses, as you saw in the previous picture on the slide. You know, they weren't able to make eye contact with the prison guards, which again gave them that sense of distance and that sense of power over them. Okay, in order to make the prison guards more intimidating, Zimbardo allowed the prisoners to actually carry clubs, which are like bats, whistles, and handcuffs, okay, to make the prison guards look more powerful and more domineering over the prisoners. Now, the guards were on duty 24 hours a day, so they could always monitor and have control over the prisoners. Zimbardo didn't give them any specific instructions. He just said that we want to make sure the prison has a reasonable level of order, that things aren't being chaotic. But Zimbardo never at any point told them to use physical violence. This was something that the prison guards eventually started to do themselves. It wasn't something that Zimbardo ordered them to do. Now, initially, the prisoners were kind of appalled by this behavior, and they started to rebel against the guards. Okay, and this happened in about the 2nd day of the study. And when the prisoners started to rebel against the guards, the prison guards felt very annoyed by this. And essentially, they started to hit the prisoners and abuse the prisoners. Okay, and after this, more and more the prisoners began to act passively, which means that they started to feel that there wasn't much they could do, that they were at the complete hands of these prison guards. Okay, now every guard at some time or the other, and it's important to emphasize that every guard at some point or the other behaved in an abusive way. There wasn't a single guard who didn't try to hit the prisoners. There wasn't a single guard who didn't try to abuse the power that Zimbardo had assigned to them. Okay, and many of them seemed to really enjoy that newfound power and control. So some of the really scary things that the guards made the prisoners do was that they'd wake up the prisoners in the middle of the night and ask them to clean the toilet with their bare hands. All the basic rights that prisoners had at the beginning of the study, like going to the toilet, eating, wearing, you know, glasses if you were short-sighted, all of those became rewards. So let's say I'm short-sighted and I can't see properly. The prison guard would take away my glasses from me. And if I did something that made them happy, they'd give me back my glasses so I could see properly. So all of these things that were initially basic rights became privileges because of the security guards. And punishments like doing push-ups and all that stuff was also something that the prison guards doled out without any kind of guilt. Okay, so if one of the prisoners did something wrong, the prison guards would tell them to do push-ups. And I'll show you a picture of that very soon. Standing for long periods of time was also a punishment. Being put into the hole was the most intense punishment. The hole was essentially this really dark room with no light, which acted as a kind of social isolation confinement room. And this guy, the one prisoner who was released due to his endless crying, fits of rage, disorganized thinking, and mental disturbances, he was actually always thrown into the hole, like many, many times throughout the study. And he actually went insane as a result of that. And he was forced to be released very quickly from the study. Okay, a few of the other prisoners also developed the same symptoms and they were also released. All the prisoners started to experience severe anxiety and a loss of identity. So they started to actually believe that there were real prisoners in a real prison and that they were guilty of some crime. Okay, they started, the line between reality and the experiment started to blur for them. Now, Zimbardo intended the experiment to run for 2 weeks, but he had to actually suspend and abandon the experiment after just 6 days because of what kind of intense psychological harm these prisoners were starting to experience. Now, ethical breaches were obviously committed in this study. The participants who were prisoners, all their safety and their welfare had been compromised. And you wouldn't believe this, but actually a lot of the participants had to be cancelled, okay? So Zimbardo had to carry out full debriefing, obviously, and a lot of the prisoners had to be cancelled for even years after the experiment was concluded or after the experiment ended. That's how intense some of the psychological trauma these prisoners actually went through was. Okay, so that's just a summary of what the entire study is about, in case some of you don't watch that video I linked before. Okay, so just giving you guys a quick data kind of analysis of what this looks like. If we look at the orange bars, they're the guards, and the blue bars are the prisoners. So you can see that in terms of commands, the guards were giving the commands almost 100% of the time. The prisoners were giving a few insults back and forth, but it was the guards that were doing most of the insulting. Most of the aggression was because of the guards. Most of the threats were from the guards. Okay, even with the use of instruments like hitting the boys with the clubs, handcuffing the prisoners, all of that was done by the guards. Okay, there was a few retaliations like throwing chairs around, throwing punches and stuff, but it wasn't as much as compared to what the guards were doing. Okay, in terms of helping behavior, this is interesting because in terms of helping behavior, the prisoners helped each other, but the guards never helped the prisoners in any instance. Okay, so they did feel like they were dehumanizing these prisoners. They didn't feel like the prisoners were human, that they should help them if they were in trouble. Okay, so resistance as well. The prisoners were the ones that were expected to resist most of the time and just clench their teeth and, accept what was going on. The guards never resisted or accepted anything that was happening. So if a prisoner spoke back to a guard, they weren't going to have any of it. They were going to hit them or they were going to punish them for that. Okay, and this is just what was observed over 6 days in the prison experiment. Okay, it's not like this experiment ran for a year or 6 months. This is the data that they got from observing the guards and the prisoners' behavior for 6 days. Okay, so it's not a lot of time at all. So what are the conclusions from Zimbardo's prison experiment? Okay, and these are just some photos. So before I read through this, I'll just show you guys these photos. So this is an actual example of the footage from the study. Okay, this is an actual example of, the prison guard and what he looked like. So you can see he looks very intimidating. You can't see his eyes, so the eye contact wasn't there. This is another picture of them bringing one of the prisoners into the actual prison. You can see he's wearing a white smock and he's blindfolded. This is another picture of the guard. So again, you can see that he's got a whistle, he's got a club, looks very intimidating. Okay, and this was the image of the university basement, which had been temporarily turned into a prison. So you can see it is very dark. It doesn't look like a university area at all. It looks more like a prison. And this is another example of a photo from the study where prisoners were commanded by the guards to stand up against a wall for long periods of time. So that is another example of a punishment that the prison guards would give the prisoners. Okay, so that's essentially, okay, let me just turn that off. Okay, anyways, so that is basically just a few pictures to show you, and I'm just going to go back one slide because this GIF, okay. So this GIF that's playing here on the left-hand side of the screen, that is basically, footage from the movie, not from the actual study. But again, the movie was quite accurate in its portrayal of the actual study anyway. So you can see this guy's doing push-ups here as punishment, the way that the guard slams his club on the table to intimidate the prisoners, the way they kind of stand over and look down on the prisoners, all that stuff is accurate of what actually happened in the Stanford prison experiment. Okay, so just a few pictures there to give you a better idea of what the Stanford prison experiment was about. So essentially, Zimbardo was successful in proving or in supporting his idea that it is situational factors and social influences that will influence how a person behaves in a given situation, more than just their individual personality. Because as we said at the beginning, none of these participants were corrupt people. None of them had history of mental disorders or history of disorders where they felt like they could hurt other people. None of them were sociopaths or psychopaths, okay? They were all normal people, but when given the role of being a prison guard, they simply just changed. They simply started to rebel in that power. And as I mentioned, as we read in the previous slide, some of these prison guards became so delighted with their role. They were so enjoying their role of being prison guard. They even told Zimbardo, hey, Zimbardo, we're happy to participate in the study for a few more days. You don't even have to pay us for it because we're just loving being prison guards. Okay, they were loving the power that they were having over the prisoners, some of them. Okay, so it's not just our personality, but our situational factors, as well as our social influences, like the social roles that we're given, that will determine our behavior at any point in time. And this essentially means, if we link this back to real life, what this means is that we're all capable of acting out of character when we are placed in certain situations or when we are assigned certain social roles, okay? And what the moral of this story is that the social power that a person possesses doesn't have to be in the form of being a security guard, could be in the form of being, you know, the prime minister of a country, it could be in the form of being, you know, the leader of a community or society. In any form or in any way, the social power that a person possesses can either make them do good, or in Stanford Prison Experiment's case, it can make them go on to act in corrupt, evil, and even inhumane ways. And this is what we see a lot of the time when we're talking about normal prisons, okay? What Stanford Prison Experiment showed us was almost exactly accurate to what actually happens in real prisons around the world, okay? That sense of power dynamic, the difference in power dynamic between a prison guard and a prisoner, and how this always leads, whichever prison movie you've watched, it always leads to the prisoners wanting to rebel against these security guards, because they don't treat them as if they were human. They treat them as if they were some other species or lesser than them. Okay, so that's essentially what the Zimbardo's prison experiment is about. And I think, yep, that brings us to the end of today's topic.